Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Hannah Gladwell. I'm coming from Goldsmith Chambers. With me, I've got David Barr, Toby Roseman, and Matthew Poulsom. We're all currently pupils at Goldsmith Chambers. Thank you for joining us today. Just so you know, the general housekeeping, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A button. So if there's any questions as we go through this webinar that you would like to put in, make sure that you send them in to us. Just so you know, you can see and hear us, but we can't see and hear you, so don't worry about that. And we're going to try and address your questions as we go through, but we will have some time at the end where we will address them. Okay. In terms of the purpose of this webinar, we're going to be looking at how the coronavirus pandemic has impacted on the criminal justice system, and particular, and how that's affecting pupils. As I say, we're all pupils currently, so we're going to try and give you some insight into what's been happening in the criminal courts, and hopefully providing you some practical advice going forward. So it's aimed towards really BPTC students that are looking for a career at the bar, and equally people that are either in pupillage at the moment or hoping to get pupillage soon. Hopefully will give you a bit of insight. So with that, I'll hand you over to David Barr, who will be dealing with the first slide.
Thanks, Hannah. So yeah, I want to talk about the transition from first six to second six, and as Hannah says, the sort of impact of the current situation. And I start off probably with a caveat that applies to a lot of what we say, which is that obviously every set of chambers will be different in some respects, and in terms of first six experience, even sort of supervisors within the same set, you can have some different experiences. But with that in mind, the sort of normal process in terms of first six is that you'll be shadowing your supervisor in the Crown Court generally, so Crown Court trials, Crown Court hearings, and of course generally those are in-person hearings or have been in person. At the moment, of course, there are many fewer of those in-person hearings, and the move has been to remote hearings. But what I want to say about that is obviously from a pupil's perspective, it's still possible to shadow your supervisor in the sense of joining those hearings remotely. And there is, to some extent, a certain amount of benefits that can come from those remote hearings as well. So remote shadowing might actually allow you to attend more hearings than you otherwise might have, just from a purely practical perspective. You can obviously sort of move between hearings at the click of a button rather than having to get all of your stuff and get back on the train and either move across the city or across the country. So from that practical perspective, and also for some of the work that you might be doing with your supervisor in your first six in terms of more administrative hearings or case management hearings, perhaps previously you might have been involved with some of that work but wouldn't always necessarily have attended the hearing itself if it's going to be quite short or involves a lot of travel. Whereas now, of course, if that's being held remotely, it means that that's much easier for you to attend. And so in that sense, you can see the work through to that sort of hearing. So there are positives to that shift to remote hearings. In terms of written work or written advocacy, that's obviously part of first six and continues to be part of first six, and there's perhaps more written work out there at the moment than there was previously, so that continues. And one perhaps change is in terms of magistrates court shadowing there, that usually it would be towards the end of your first six, as you're looking towards getting on your feet, that you would then perhaps shadow some more junior members of chambers in the magistrates courts to see the sort of thing that you'll be getting up to. And I think it's fair to say that the magistrates courts are sort of getting things up to speed a little bit quicker in the current situation than the Crown courts, because of the obvious sort of practical burdens that are in place for jury trials. And so to that extent, you might get more experience of going to the magistrates courts at an earlier stage in your first six than otherwise might normally have been the case. And obviously that's going to be valuable to you when you come to your initial practice. In terms of training, obviously in your first 6 you'll have your Inns of Court training that you'll attend, but also your in-house training within chambers, and again that will vary across chambers, but is always going to be a sort of valuable part of your first 6, whether it's the sort of more discursive sessions looking at the practicalities of first appearances and client conferences, or it's the more sort of traditional advocacy exercises, bail applications, pleas and mitigation. That is still part of first 6, is still there for you to get that feedback from members of chambers. We've certainly had some training remotely that's been done. So in terms of for pupils getting that valuable feedback, that's still something that's going to be there for you. And one new feature maybe of training is looking towards sort of conducting remote hearings or virtual hearings, remote conferences with clients. And I think certainly as a chambers, we've had chambers-wide training on the new cloud platform that's being rolled out across the courts network. And an advantage, I suppose, if you're coming to pupillage a bit later, is that there won't perhaps be the same sense of having to play catch up, which all practitioners across the board have had to do, where changes have been coming in sort of thick and fast, certainly in the early stages. So that's a sort of a broad overview. I've obviously focused on the lead up to second 6, and Toby and I both started our second 6 on the 1st of April, so right in the midst of lockdown. And I think certainly from my perspective, it's fair to say that you look towards second 6 with anticipation, and you're eager to get out there. And with all of this, probably did add that level of anxiety where you're thinking, everything that I thought I knew about magistrates court procedure is somehow going to be turned on its head. But I suppose, you know, everyone around you is sort of talking about the new normal, and as pupils starting your second 6 in the midst of lockdown, you sort of think, well, I didn't even know what normal was beforehand. But essentially, my sort of take on it is that obviously this is a profession that's about adapting and thinking on your feet, and so in that sense it's a good exercise. But also I'd say that the fundamentals of the job haven't changed, in the sense that you are representing clients, you're taking instructions, you're reading briefs, you're advising clients, you're advising on evidence. And yes, there are the practical challenges, and I know we're going to talk about those, but the fundamentals of your role in starting out your practice and representing people in court, as you've always wanted to do, that's still in place. So that's probably my take on it. If that sort of covers that sort of initial transition, I don't know if anyone else has anything to come in on from that perspective. No?
Oh, I think David, your and Toby's experience of this is going to be somewhat different to myself and Matthew's, because I'm a third 6 pupil. I know Matthew had been on his feet a couple of months before lockdown happened. So it's interesting, I think, to hear from your perspective what happened in the lead up to it. So it's good. I'm going to try and try and place a positive spin on it. So changes and challenges. So what we have found going forward when conducting remote hearings or even attending in person in court. Now, in terms of the short term, clearly lockdown happened quite quickly. Nobody was really prepared for it. Certainly the court systems weren't in place to allow for remote hearings as they are now. So we have seen a huge shift in the ability to conduct remote hearings, whether that's using Skype for Business, Microsoft Teams. All of those sort of software and systems are being used now in court, which is brilliant. And for the short term, really, from my point of view, I've seen a big shift from attending court in person to then conducting a hearing remotely. Now, I know David did touch upon how that's impacted on his second six. And he's right, really, the procedures are still the same. You're still giving advice to the clients, you're still making submissions in court. But really, in terms of the short-term challenges, we've got to consider technology. There's been a number of issues I know with, well, myself personally, using technology, whether that's counsel for the CPS, for example, not being able to hear me, or just the signal not being fantastic. So certainly a lot of practitioners have had to deal with that. Our home setups probably aren't in place to allow for a proper effective hearing, but certainly people are coming through it, and we are having training to assist us with using these facilities. So certainly in the short term, that's been a big step for the last few weeks. I'd also say, in terms of change of pace, for myself, I'm the third six pupil, so I was in court every day really, up until lockdown hit. And it's certainly been different. Maybe the level of written work has increased. And certainly I found that there has been a change, but equally it's a welcome change in that you have more time to put towards other areas, for example. In terms of short-term challenges as well, you don't have the benefit of roving room advice from colleagues that are there, like sometimes you could do. For example, if you've got a first appearance where you've only just had papers through, you don't have the benefit of being able to sit with somebody else and having their view on it. But certainly we still have technology. I know for us, we all have a pupils group and a pupil support group, where if there's a question that needs immediately answering, we've got a range of practitioners that are there on hand to help us. So that support is still there, it's just not necessarily in the same way as we've had before. In going forward, there are long-term changes we can predict. I've touched on the technology in court. I'd like to think that that's there to stay. Now, the courts have put in a huge amount of resources and money into getting these systems up and running. And I think that practitioners are seeing a real shift in being able to conduct smaller, more administrative hearings virtually and over either the telephone, for example, for a PTPH. I certainly think that that's a welcome change. It means that you don't have to travel across the country to do a 10-minute hearing, for example. But of course, that comes with its challenges as well, because people are still getting used to the software. Now, for pupils that are coming in to start in September, for example, or those that are looking for a career at the bar later on, I'm sure that that sort of training will be involved now, and certainly there's going to be more preparation involved than what we've had. But I certainly see that there's going to be a change long term for this, and a welcome change. Now, I've put here on the side about routine and changing routine. I've said that before in terms of the shift that I felt from going from a more busy practice at the start, but it's certainly picking up now in the last few weeks. I wonder whether maybe Toby or David, you have anything more that you want to add than what you've already said when you were talking, David, about maybe what you were expecting when you were in your first six and the reality of what's happened now.
Yeah, I think certainly looking towards starting second six, you sort of are expecting to be out and about, going all over the place and getting all these experiences and going to court. And certainly in the initial weeks, obviously we started on the 1st of April, which was really just going into the early weeks of lockdown, where I think people sort of that you would normally turn to, everyone was saying, well, none of us really know exactly what's going to be in place. And things were slow for those few weeks at the start. So in that sense, it was a difference that none of us could really predict. And the people that you normally turn to, who are still there supporting you, you know, these are things that people don't have answers to. So I think that was an adjustment. But yeah, that's probably what I would say.
I think something that we've also not touched on really at the moment is Crown Court. I know a lot of this talk is tailored towards pupils, so really predominantly your practice, at least in the early stages, is going to be in the Magistrates' Court. But certainly for first six pupils that are coming through, I think it's important to note the changes that are occurring in the Crown Court at the moment. I think that there was a study that had gone out to say that now they're trying to use It's a minimum of 3 courtrooms per jury trial now, in order to practice safe social distancing and allow time for adequate breaks, for hand washing and that sort of thing. So that's obviously a huge shift to what is normally the process in the Crown Court. And clearly it means that not as many trials are going forward. So it'll be interesting to see the shift in what happens in the coming months from that. So it's all unknown at the moment, but it's certainly an interesting time to go through pupillage, and we're all learning and we're all assisting where we can. But it's interesting nonetheless.
So I'll be talking about the training and support that we've received, and despite the current situation we've been in, we have been receiving ongoing training and support from Chambers, but also from the Inns of Court as well. So I think the headline for this slide really should be that if you're about to start your first or second six, or you will be in the coming months, that you shouldn't be worried. Certainly my supervisor, my current supervisor, checks in with me weekly. And if I haven't had that much work to do in a given week, he's given me some of his own work to help him with, and he's made sure that I've been kept busy. And even my previous supervisor is still checking up on me and including me in written work, and he's invited me to watch some of his remote hearings and things like that as well. As David mentioned, in-house training has continued as it would have had we not been in lockdown. It's just been remote, and so nothing's really changed in relation to that. I also know that external training, so for example, the Inns of Court College of Advocacy, the ICCA, has actually been running small advocacy training sessions, I think almost daily, just to help pupils get a little bit more experience if they're not going to court that regularly. There's also been opportunities to undertake training in relevant practice areas. So for example, me and some of my co-pupils have just undertaken vulnerable witness handling training, which should come in handy in the future. I think written work has already been mentioned, but I've been given quite a lot of my own written work to do, and also other members of Chambers have given me written work to do when I have been less busy, and they've offered to read over things. And so people are still making sure that I'm being kept busy and that I'm still developing. There's also been opportunities to explore new areas. So I haven't really done this too much, but I know some of my co-pupils have managed to take part in webinars and training in areas other than crime and family that they practice in, that they are interested in. And they've reached out to other members in Chambers to be involved in what they're doing. In terms of the support that the clerks have given us, they've been really supportive. I know they didn't put any pressure on, certainly me and David, to go to court if we didn't feel like we would be safe. And if we had decided to go to court as brand new second six pupils, they made sure that we weren't doing anything outside of our comfort zone. So we were only undertaking work that we felt that we were able to do. On the social side of things, Chambers has been, well, we've had quite a regular film night for everyone to see each other and catch up. There's a Chambers quiz which is coming up soon. So even the social situations, the social occasions that Chambers would normally have, we're trying to continue them as best we can remotely, and it's working. Chambers itself has a wellbeing committee who have been sharing regular updates and techniques on how to cope within lockdown and I suppose work remotely. And I've also been receiving a lot of emails from external bodies such as the Inns of Court as well. All in all, I'd say that Chambers has been very supportive, and it won't just be our Chambers. I know other people's Chambers have been supportive to them as well. And I've still been able to learn and develop in this time. So again, echoing my words at the start, I would say that this isn't a period to be worried about if you're going to be starting soon. And personally, I'd feel that my pupillage experience hasn't suffered dramatically because of all of this. I think that's really all I can say for training support.
Right, well, that brings us on to the practical information slide. And you may have been able to tell there that I actually had a bit of trouble unmuting my microphone, which possibly brings us on to one of the first points, which is to make sure you've got all your technology sorted out correctly. People, understandably are being very flexible at the moment and very pragmatic, and some of the systems are bearing up better than others in terms of logging on. We've had some sort of quite entertaining hearings where judges disappear and then you get clerks appearing in their place, and then the barristers, lose audio and things like that. But whilst all that is quite unusual, as I say, people are being sort of quite realistic about, the systems aren't necessarily set up at the moment to handle it all perfectly, and just sort of to make the best of those. And that brings me on to the second point there, which is, do make sure as far as you can to get all your tech sorted out in advance of the hearing, rather than frantically scrabbling around at the last minute, because of course that's going to put you off your stride. On that point as well, it's really important to sort of get in contact with your clerks nice and early to make sure that the court has all the correct details for you, and that you have the correct links to click on to get into whatever online hearings are taking place. So there's just a little bit more admin than perhaps you would normally have under regular conditions. But it all seems to broadly be working quite well for remote hearings, certainly for the ones I've done. And then, and absolutely, don't be afraid to ask others. People are sort of learning about how these remote hearings are working at the same time. Different courts are running things in different ways, and so it is really useful to talk to other people who may have been to a court that you're going to for the first time under these conditions, to see how they're treating things, and sort of get the insight in advance about that. Crime Line is one of the points on there. It's a really useful online resource. I think probably some of my fellow pupils might be better placed to give you all the details of that. But it's just as we say there, in terms of contacting clients who may be in prison and trying to arrange remote interviews, remote conferences with them. It's just a useful source to get those details so that you can get in contact. That is one of the sort of the practical challenges we've been finding with these hearings. It's because, of course, as you're not necessarily there in person, and all the various parties are potentially geographically distributed around the country, it's a case of sort of trying to make all the different links and to speak to people privately and to take your instructions, so that you can still go ahead with following your professional obligations when you actually get into the hearing itself, having had all those conversations behind the scenes, as it were, without actually being able to talk directly to people. And then, I think as has already been covered to some extent, it's always worth talking during pupillage to fellow pupils and to juniors in chambers. I think it's been mentioned that we have a pupil support group, and we're free to ask all those silly questions that perhaps become very obvious once you've been doing this for a bit longer. But as pupils, we don't necessarily have the experience, so it is useful to have those contacts and to just make sure you make the most use you can of that, and also to just discuss your experiences amongst the other pupils. I think that's probably all I've got, unless anyone else wants to jump in.
I was just going to pick up, Matt, on the sort of where you were mentioning the differences between different courts, that you might think that you've just grasped the system and then you are appearing in a different court remotely and they have a slightly different approach. And I think that's definitely has been my experience, even just in sort of what people seem to be terming etiquette, about you might have all of the links and know how to get in touch with the court, but in terms of whether you are getting in touch by email with the legal advisor, or then getting contact details for the prosecutor and they'll tell you when to join the hearing, or whether you're joining the hearing and then it's sorted out from there, my experience has been that that varies from court to court, and obviously the only way to sort that out is, like you say, keeping those lines of communication open. If someone knows in advance, can tell you, and either colleagues in chambers or other pupils in pupil support groups, great. But that's sort of something to watch out for. And I think we had a question that's sort of come up about CVP, and that sort of related to this, CVP being the platform that's being rolled out in the courts for these remote hearings and is in place in magistrates' courts at the moment for sort of relevant to us as pupils. So it's basically like the software that's being used, which is sort of not all singing and dancing like Zoom might be, but it's supposed to be a sort of solid bit of software that you can do the basics essentially. But that's what we mean by CVP. I don't know exactly what it stands for actually, but the cloud platform.
Cloud video platform.
Cloud video platform, yeah. So that's exactly how you're getting in touch with magistrates' courts or appearing in hearings. So yeah.
I would also say I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe it's criminal courts at the moment, but they are looking to roll it out for the civil and family courts. I know that we've had a question in about civil courts. Now, I should say that all of us are predominantly criminal pupils, but I do know that we keep up to date with it. So the first question we've had in is, can I ask what experience you can share re the outlook for civil courts reopening fully? I'm starting pupillage in a civil set in September. I wonder if anyone is able to assist with that question.
Without being able to sort of give away government plans, because clearly I don't know what they are, I have read a variety of articles that say that as part of the process to try and clear the backlog of civil cases, they are looking at applying the sort of Nightingale Hospital principle to create Nightingale courts. Clearly it won't necessarily work for criminal courts where you need an element of security and so on, but there have been discussions about opening civic buildings to deal with those civil cases, to just try and clear the backlog. I don't know whether that's gone ahead or is going ahead, but I know as of last week, I think they were still reviewing the funding to see whether it was achievable. So that's not a particularly clear answer, but it is something that they are, or at least were last week, actively looking at. But yeah, that's probably all I can help with on that one.
Yeah, there have been a number of sort of telephone hearings as well for in civil courts, and I know with in sort of the immigration sector that's been something, and remote hearings that are already in place for example, some of the bail hearings in immigration that are already up and running. So yeah,
I'll also just interject there. I do some family work, mainly care proceedings, and pretty much all of those hearings are now moved onto a remote platform. So I've got a 3-day interim hearing on Monday to Wednesday next week. So that's certainly something that's being implemented more frequently. I think it was more family courts to start with, and they've used that software then going forward from the criminal courts. So we've certainly seen a shift there.
I can see that we've had a question about the nature of the written work that we're referring to. So, because I'm primarily a criminal pupil, the written work that I largely get asked to do is to advise on evidence or to look at the prospects of a potential prosecution or something like that. So that's really the form that it often takes. I don't know if Matt wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I thought it might be interesting to just say that one of the pieces of written work I was doing, which was on behalf of my supervisor, was applying some of the new CPS guidance, because there's been some further guidance that's been released during the lockdown period. So clearly, because the criminal courts have been building up a backlog of cases, the CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, have said that it's worth re-looking at some cases to see whether continuing with the prosecution is still in the public interest. And so that's one of the pieces of written work that I worked on, which is reviewing, it was a case, I won't go into the details, but to see whether bearing in mind that there's potentially going to be quite a significant delay before it can be heard at court, whether it's actually worth the CPS pursuing that. So that's just an example of one of the pieces of written work. In some ways, it's administrative in nature, but obviously it does directly relate to a live case that you can do without having to go to court.
I've just seen another question that's come up here. So do you find yourself investing in equipment that you would not have bought if lockdown had not happened? So a bigger laptop or screen or a sophisticated printer? In terms of printer, I think at the moment there's some issues in terms of handing over paperwork in court. I know that I was in the magistrates court on Wednesday and the legal advisor was very strict that if there was any exhibits or paperwork that needs to be handed up, then where possible we needed to make use of technology. So either taking a photograph and trying to put it up on the screen for everybody in the court to see. So I think printing papers is a matter for an individual as to how they like to work. In terms of equipment, I'm quite lucky in that I have a laptop already and I also have an iPad. I think it is important to note that whilst you've got a hearing on your laptop screen, for example, if that's running through Skype or through Microsoft Teams or one of those platforms, ordinarily if you're in court you'd have the benefit of being able to either open up a Word document to make a note of the hearing or have the papers up. At least with criminal cases, a lot of the papers now are on the electronic system, so there's not as much paperwork that's seen in court, but like I said, it is a matter for each practitioner as to how they like to conduct their cases. But it is certainly useful to think about the practical side of things, that if you have a remote hearing up on your laptop, if you still need to view the paperwork, then maybe having another screen next to you, if possible. Obviously it's quite difficult to purchase these things at the moment, but it's just trying to work a way around it to make use of what you've got without maybe too much expense, because we're not sure how long this is going to go on for. I don't know whether anybody's got anything else to add or if there's any other questions that have come up.
No, I think just on the sort of practical point, like you say, I've only got my laptop, so I have my little notes. I print out perhaps more than I normally would and have it next to me out of shot normally, and so I've got that to refer to. But yeah, I think additional screens would probably be helpful, but we're coping without. But I think in terms of questions that we've had through, yeah, there was just one about sort of specifically for those of us in second six, in terms of awards and things, that has not been a concern in second six, that's something that Chambers have kept up. And so yeah, so that's not been a concern as such for second six. But other than that, I think hopefully we've helped cover some of the practical challenges and some of the reality of getting on your feet during this slightly challenging time. But hopefully what's come across is that whilst this is a challenge for everyone, pupils and even the most senior people and the most senior judges all having to adapt, that ultimately, like we were sort of saying at the start, the fundamentals of the job and what your role are haven't changed, and so that should be of some comfort to you in terms of starting pupillage or looking to start pupillage. But yeah, I don't know unless anyone else has anything to add.
I think that's it. I've put up on the screen here some contact details of our clerks. So if there's any questions that people have, absolutely feel free to get in touch with one of our clerks and they can pass on some of the questions. In terms of those who have signed up to this webinar today, there should be an email going around, hopefully in the next day or two, which will include hopefully a link to the video. So if you'd like to access it again or circulate it around. And the slides, although they're not in too much detail, if they're useful as well, they should also be attached to the email. But thank you very much for everybody attending today. And with that, I'll end the webinar.